from Daniel Berrigan, a Jesuit priest, a poet, and a peace activist. The one who tells the story knows both goodness and wickedness because he is good, consistent, and compassionate. He longs to see humans standing in the orbit of God's love. He rejoices to see the speechless and poor, the nobodies at his table. In our story, he condemns no one, not even the king. Such a judgment is redundant, the royal behavior being self-condemning. And to sum up matters, in utter contrast to the worldly king, Jesus, the storyteller, will give his life rather than take life. Nothing happens in a vacuum. As an MSW student back in the 1970s, studying systems theory at Fordham in my 20s, I really didn't fully appreciate how accurate that statement was. Nothing happens in a vacuum. We really do need to be aware and understand how all the aspects, all the forces at play in people's lives come together to impact them and create reactions and actions. To understand behavior, we need to understand the context in which it occurs. Given the chaos we are experiencing in our world today, war in multiple arenas, famine, fires, droughts, and intense tropical storms, we are hearing from some media sources about the very real presence of pure evil at work. While I certainly would not deny the existence of Satan, I prefer to take a more analytical approach, including a historical perspective, to try and understand why we are experiencing these things at this time. Prayer for strength and direction to understand the action required in these situations is also necessary. But judging, I will leave to God. In today's gospel, we hear Matthew's version of the royal wedding banquet. To understand this parable, we also need to appreciate the context in which it was written. The gospel, according to Matthew, is often characterized as the most Jewish of the synoptic gospels in language and content. This gospel contains an abundant use of Old Testament quotations. It was written at a time of both conflict and dialogue with Jewish communities at the end of the 1st century, with a particular focus on the community of recent converts from Judaism. We find some references in the text to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, a source of pain and controversy for the Jewish people. Matthew was writing for a Jewish audience that was experiencing internal conflict around leadership and identity. Considering this parable from a historical perspective, many things occurred that impacted the Jewish people in the 1st century CE. Jesus, considered by some of the Jewish community to be a prophet, the Messiah, or a political agitator, functioned as an itinerant preacher between 30 and 33 CE. His preaching drew crowds, and some people became his followers. His teaching and growing popularity across the social classes, but especially among the poor and marginalized people, was perceived as a threat by the religious authorities. Jesus was ordered by the Roman authorities to be executed in 33 CE. Jesus' death created religious, social, and political repercussions initially in the Roman colony of Palestine. We as Christians would say that Jesus' life and death eventually influenced the entire world, and that his influence continues to impact our world today. Throughout history, the Jewish people have experienced war, captivity, attempts at extermination, and occupation of what some consider their homeland. Matthew, at the time of composing the gospel we are reading, was probably aware of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple by the Roman army in 70 CE. Jerusalem and the temple were central to the identity of the Jewish community. The centrality of Jerusalem, even today, is recognized by the 3 Abrahamic religions, as the city is the site of places sacred to Jews, Muslims, and Christians. So with this background as context, we need to be cautious in interpreting parables. We need to understand the times in which they were written, the intended audience, and remember we are reading a parable, an allegory, a story that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. In today's world, it's also helpful to remember what the philosopher George Santana wrote in 1905. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The royal wedding parable is challenging to understand. It has so many strange plot twists, especially the issue regarding the appropriate wedding garment. But remembering we are not to take all the content literally, what is the message for us? If we interpret the king as representing God, we could be concerned about judgment and salvation. The king in this parable can be pretty harsh, but the king keeps inviting all people, constantly sending out his servants to bring more and more people to the table. So how do we see ourselves in terms of where do we stand in God's eyes? Can we accept that if God invites us to the banquet table, we are already okay? Salvation has been earned. We need to show up and gratefully accept God's love and mercy. Our God does not give up on us, regardless of the number of times we may give up on God. While God never gives up on us, we do at times seem to reject God. The parable tells us that some people decline the invitation. That was really puzzling. Who turns down a royal party, complete with free food and drink? Okay? Here we need to think about what comes before God in our busy contemporary lives. Jobs, property, wealth, addictions, and other things we use to define ourselves and our worth. These are the things we often make into false gods. We are not okay in the eyes of God for what we have or what we do. We are okay for who we are, a child of God, a good person who does the right thing for the right reason, and who maintains right relationships with God, self, and others. This parable challenges our notions about what is truly valuable, especially in God's eyes. By continually inviting everyone in the streets to the banquet, God declares their preference for the marginalized. Wealth, status, and power are not important to God. If we follow this interpretation, what do we do with the issue of the wedding garment? What symbolism is there in attire? To gain a seat at the table, we must be willing to accept God's teachings and behave accordingly. What goes into the weaving of our days? How do we blend all that is required of us into our hearts and minds, so as to be able to be Christ to one another? How do we put on Christ daily and go out into the world, demonstrating his continued presence by our love, mercy, and working for justice and peace that is so desperately needed in these times? God's grace is what saves us. There is room for all at the banquet table. We are appropriately clothed to go out each day and call all to the table of love, peace, and grace. Amen.
Amen.